We will start this roundtable discussion, and I will immediately give the floor to Mr. Garry Jacobs. He's the chairman and CEO of the World University Consortium. Mr. Jacobs, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Pierre. I'd like to start off. We'll have brief panel discussions for about 7 minutes each. I'm in a dual capacity as a panelist and moderator, and then we would like to open it up and have at least a half an hour to have discussion Q&A with the panelists and with you, those of you who have pressing questions or comments that have you been holding in all day long and need an opportunity to vent. So I'd like to start by introducing Roberto Peccei, who's a professor of physics and astronomy at UCLA, formerly the vice chancellor of research at UCLA, vice president of the Club of Rome. Roberto, please.
Thank you, Garry. We were asked to remark on 2 questions today. First of all, what kind of economies and society we need in order to operate within the boundaries of a finite planet? And the second, how do we rediscover a harmonious relationship between humanity and nature? And I think if you think of both those questions, the answer to both of those questions lies in how we address the issue of growth. Now, it's about it. Cannot operate within planetary boundaries if the world population continues to grow. You cannot have a finite system and have something just continues to grow. However, we cannot also remain within these boundaries if we do not alter our present economic system, since that is also a driver beside population of the system. Now, this is a more difficult thing to address because in our society we believe that curtailing this activity is a contradictory things, but in fact we must attempt to do something of that sort. Now, in terms of the population part, I think we are in much better shape than in terms of the economic part. Indeed, we may be going towards a demographic transition. In the 20 years since the Cairo Conference on Population, the population grew from 5.7 billion to 7.2 billion. But at the same time, there was a decrease of fertility in women, which in fact, in the last 40 years, the fertility of women, that is the number of births per woman, went from 4.5 down to 2.5. And so this gives you hope that indeed the world population may be approaching a demographic transition. If you extrapolate present trends of population, including the fertility, you estimate, at least the UN estimates, that we will have something like 9.6 billion people in the year 2050. Now, it is very important what exactly you put in for a fertility rate of women. If you add half a child on average, you end up by not having 9.6 billion in the year 2050, you end up by having almost 11 billion in the year 2050. If you subtract half a child from a fertility curve, what you get is instead of 9.6 billion, you get 8.4 billion. And clearly there's tremendous difference what a world of 8.4 billion will be in 2050 compared to a world of 11 billion. One is a world that is going toward a real demographic transition. The other is a world which gives us tremendous difficulties. Now, one of the important things is that changing population or helping make this transition toward a more stable world population is an achievable goal because one knows practically that more educated women have lower fertility. And indeed, there's a very nice study by 2 people from YASA, Casey and Lutz, that show that if you have more girl education and more economic opportunity for girls, you can affect the fertility curves in such a way that you will have about 1 billion less people than what the UN projects. That is, this half a child is in fact an achievable thing for women's education. So that's a place where there is, I think, some real hope. On the other hand, to mitigate the and reverse the ecological impact of this continuous increasing economic activity is very much more difficult. And in part it's difficult because you do not know what the final answer for the economy will be. There are certain concepts like return on investment or compound interest that always say that you're growing. But how can you have that in a world that is supposed to be not driven by growing forces? So although it's very difficult to figure out what the final economy may be, what is more likely is to think through, and indeed that's some of the things that Graham Exton was telling you today, is try to think what will ameliorate the transition. And I think there are four things that I would like to remark very briefly here on how to ameliorate this transition. One has to do how you manage resources. One has to do how you deal with climate change. One has to do with how you deal with ecosystem, and finally the last one has to do with the financial sector. I would just talk about the management of resources, and I'll talk about climate change, and leave perhaps the other two for the discussion. It is clear that we must manage the world resources in a much better way than we're doing now. We have been spendthrift where we should be thrifty with resources. Resources at some point will end, and so we must husband them at best. And so it is quite important to, in fact, use efficiency to try to use resources the least possible. And indeed, if you can use efficiency and then do not lose what you gain by efficiency by then consuming more, there is a good chance that, in fact, you can go forward. More important is also to try to rethink through how you manufacture things, and so to reuse what you produce. Go much more to a leasing kind of a mentality instead of a buying mentality. Who needs a drill? You will use a drill for 6 minutes a year. Perhaps you should lease a drill, or similar things of that sort. So we are very, we have a very unhealthy attitude toward resources. We're in a throwaway society. We must learn much more to husband things, and indeed to think through processes from the beginning to the end, more of a circular economy idea. On climate change, my comment is that it is extremely important that we make this transition. In fact, if you know the answer, why shouldn't you go in that direction? It is clear that if you ask anybody, 100 years from now, we will not be on a carbon economy. So why don't we start now in that path and do it in the most efficient way possible? Governor Ritter talked a little bit about the efforts of the states to do different things. I live in California, and California is a good example of doing things, even though others have not yet started in this path. And our governor has a three-point plan for improving climate by the year 2030. Now, whether, of course, California cannot improve it by itself, but they can take steps that, if others follow, will help. So his three-point plan is 50%, 50%, and 50%. The first 50% is to make sure that, in fact, our electricity generation is done by 50% renewable. This is much more than other goals. This is by the year 2030, that is 15 years from now. 50% is a decrease in actual consumption of fossil fuel for transportation. That means really a tremendous amount of electric cars and different means of transportation in California. And 50% is increasing the efficiency in buildings, which are still quite inefficient. Now, will that plan pass the legislature? Will it be modified? Of course, but that's part of the process. If you do not start the process now, you'll never get there. So these are my comments. Let me stop at this point. I promise you a minute. I'm a man of my promise, so I stop.
Thank you. I think I'm supposed to thank you, Roberto, for stopping, but I was eager to hear more.
I can tell you more.
I know. Okay. Our next speaker, Dimitri Zenghelis, who's Senior Visiting Fellow from the London School of Economics. Dimitri?
Thank you very much, Garry. Okay. Just working out how much time I've got there. Great, thank you, Garry. Well, we've heard a lot this morning about some of the problems of resource efficiency and resource sustainability and climate change. My comments are going to focus on climate change, but I will try and say something more generally about the broader problem of living within our resource envelope. And in many respects, climate change is the easy bit. We have the technologies to, for example, generate renewable electrons, and it doesn't matter whether an electron is green and brown, provided that it provides energy. It's much harder to find direct substitutes for things like land or sodium or potassium and so on. So climate change is one of the elements that we actually could solve if we wanted to, and yet we are still struggling to do so in a way that puts us within a reasonable chance of meeting our 2-degree targets. We know that those targets mean an ambitious change in the profile of emissions. They've got to more or less peak globally within the next decade or so, and then come down, be half the level approximately they are today by 2050. And for developed economies, those reductions have to be far more ambitious still. Most countries will need to cut by about 80% by mid-century to have a chance of meeting these targets. As we've heard this morning, we are not on a trajectory consistent with those kinds of targets, so there's a lot to do. And that raises the question, of course, can we be green and grow? Well, the answer to that depends entirely, as Roberto hinted just now, on innovation, on how we can innovate to use the resources we have to get more out of them, to use them more cleverly and more efficiently. Rich countries, for the most part, are growing not because of greater resource use. In fact, the bulk of growth for developed economies comes through what's called total factor productivity, which is just that. It is the way we use resources through innovation, through technologies, through processes, and so on. And we need to accelerate that and also redirect that in the direction of efficiency and renewables. The market is not going to do that by itself. Why? Because, for example, energy and transport are highly regulated, publicly steered sectors. And moreover, there are very strong inertia effects, what we call complementarities. It's always easier for the incumbent to find resources to build on the stock of knowledge, what Newton called standing on the shoulders of giants. It's much harder for new entrants to enter new networks. Nobody wants to be the first person to build a network, because the value of a network only comes into play when there are others on it. You don't want to pick up the phone and have no one on the end of the line. You don't want to be the only person on Facebook and so on. So it's much harder to start new networks. Innovation is also very path-dependent. Learning and experience means the cost of new technologies tend to come down. So the early movers tend to be the ones that face the highest cost. That requires public intervention in order to steer economies towards new, low-cost, renewable and energy-efficient technologies. The market itself may not deliver that, but once you've done that, once you've built new networks, once the costs have come down, once supportive institutions come into play and supportive lobbies come into play, then actually there's no reason to believe that these new technologies will be any more expensive than the existing ones. Indeed, I was talking at lunch about the nonsense of the IPCC projections that the cost of going green by 2100 is going to be of the order of something like 2 to 11% of GDP, thus completely discounting the possibility that after, and this is under a 2-degree scenario, right, that after 80 years of putting all our best minds of all of humanity's resources into going down a green path, it will somehow still be cheaper to dig resources out of the ground, stick them onto ships, trains, pump them through pipes, transport them across the world, and burn them, than it would be to extract them from the air, from the sun, from the sea, and so on, with a few breakthroughs in storage and what have you. That isn't even allowed for, and of course it's palpable nonsense. If we were to put our ambitions into doing that, we would achieve that. And there's no reason to believe that it would be any more costly than carrying on under the status quo. Indeed, there are many reasons to believe it will be the opposite. But in order to get that shift in innovation, you need a very strong and clear and credible policy signal. Otherwise, innovators, entrepreneurs will not commit their resources, financial and intellectual, to developing and innovating. They will wait for someone else to go first. And we are stuck in this after you style waiting game. And that requires intervention in order to get over that. Why are there so many barriers? Well, the barriers, they're not economic, they're not technological, they are political, they are cultural, they're institutional. Change tends to be resisted. The losers from change know exactly who they are, they know how much they're going to lose, and they know exactly which politicians to lobby. The beneficiaries tend to be much more diffuse. They're all of us, they are future generations, and they are potential innovators and companies in sectors that may not even exist yet. And so they lobby much less hard. And it's a classic problem. It's one we faced before in technological revolutions. In the UK, the kerosene and whaling industries that produced the candle wax lobbied very hard against the transition to electrification. That doesn't mean that electrification was wrong either from an environmental or from an economic point of view, and yet things that are clearly in society's interests are often very difficult to instigate when they require substantial transformational change. So I think, kind of by way of introduction, the main essence of what I would like to say is we should increasingly focus on where the real barriers are. It is a distraction to talk about cost and technology barriers. It really is about institutional, political, and cultural barriers, and that's where we need to focus our attention.
Thank you very much, Dimitri, for giving us a focus for the last part of our discussion. Take it really to the big picture, which I hope is where we're going. Adam doesn't need any introduction here. He's the man behind everything that's been happening here today, and we thank you for this, Adam. Please.
Thank you, Gary. Before bouncing back on some of the remarks from Roberto and Dimitri, I'd like to give a little bit of feedback on what's been happening today. We have organized this conference with the objective of sending a very strong message, a message from the city of Geneva. And what does this mean? Geneva, the city of peace, the city of human rights, the city of international solidarity, the city of the Red Cross, and tomorrow we'll have the Secretary General of the IFRC with us. It's the city that will be talking about not only a green economy, but a green and inclusive economy. And this is the message we're sending to the climate conference in Paris. You've had a number of representatives from France today. There will be some more tomorrow. There will be the city of Paris. And we are working to be very present through not only Green Cross, but an entire coalition of organizations that represent international Geneva. And everyone here should know that Geneva has the largest green network in the world. And that is something we are very proud of. It's something that the state of Geneva, present here, and one of our key partner in organizing this event, and the preparations for this event started a year ago, exactly in October, when Mr. Maté came to visit us in Zurich, where Green Cross had a board meeting with President Gorbachev. And so this is an adventure that started in October. Today is one stop in this event, but then it continues to Paris and beyond. Over 1,200 people have attended today's conference. So people have been coming in and out. 1,100 have registered, 12 have actually attended. So the interest is very high, and the presence of organizations, and I'm looking here, ISO, IUCN, so many of the Geneva-based organizations have partnered with us, and we're very happy to send a very strong message to Paris. Now, a couple of points in terms of why is it progress is not happening? Because we have the technology, and as we always say, and I was around today, but we must have had some PowerPoints that didn't work. Technology will not save us. We need much more. I'll give you an example. Energy efficient light bulbs. Poland has the world's second biggest factory in the world of energy efficient light bulbs, and yet the market penetration of these light bulbs, so market share of energy efficient light bulbs in Poland is the lowest in the EU. What's happening? The economics are so compelling for energy efficiency, we should all be racing. And I see some entrepreneurs here. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I talked at the General Assembly of TAG Heuer to all of the employees. And the head of TAG Heuer was walking towards, was in fact being a little bit forced into energy efficiency and renovating its entire buildings and factories because of Leonardo DiCaprio. But after doing this, he said that the economics of energy efficiency are so compelling that he will do this in all the factories, in all the offices that he will ever be working in. So what's blocking us? What is blocking us is exactly what Dimitri said. A few weeks back, I was at a conference in Poland, the little of Central and Eastern Europe in Krynica, and we had a representative from the energy utility speaking at a panel on renovating buildings. And he talked about all of the reasons why we should not have energy efficiency, why we should not reduce electricity bills for people, why we should not reduce carbon emissions. And the reason is because the electricity utility will reduce its profits because they are remunerated based on the volume of sales. What do we have a solution for this? In California, already 40 years ago, a concept called decoupling. Decoupling energy utility profits from sales and providing the energy utility a percentage of the savings that they are able to generate for the customers. So for example, and this is more or less the figures that they are using in California, when the utility saves $100 for its clients, it gets to keep 11% of that. So 11 francs goes straight into the bottom line. And that is higher than their margins. So their objective becomes reducing energy bills for their customers, reducing climate emissions, and everyone is better off. And this has become the largest source of profits for the California utilities, and it's spreading across the US despite a little bit of at the political level, a little bit of I guess, intervention, but the economics are so compelling that it's moving ahead anyway. So this is it for my opening remarks. Thank you, Garry.
Thank you, Adam, many times. I'm going to start with a few remarks as panelist and then transit into our open discussion. I'd like to start by saying I'm a little bewildered because something's happened here today for me, which I really didn't expect. I don't know how you feel about it. We started off this morning, I think, with a very strong, realistic note in the presentation that Martin Lees made, talking about challenges of unprecedented scale, magnitude, and complexity. And I think we all share that feeling that we really are dealing with, we really are at a period of tremendous challenge to humanity as a whole. Alexander Lickitall reinforced that and expanded on it, talking about multiple crises. Graham Maxton said business as usual. All the data reinforces the fact it is not an option. Alexander also made it clear that more of the conventional approach, more conventional road mapping is not going to deliver the goods, that we need rapid transition to a new model, he said, or paradigm, which involves not just energy and resource consumption, but economy and governance, society and leadership. A massive change in society of unprecedented magnitude. Many of the speakers agreed that the existing models are failing. Simply can't take us there. So far, I felt I was in familiar territory. I've heard and interacted on these themes very much. Then we started hearing a series of presentations. I'm not going to review them, and certainly, but talking about some of the things that have been achieved concretely, or are being achieved today, or can be achieved and are really within reach. Like we heard from Bill Ritter about the energy initiatives in Colorado and California and other places. Alexander mentioned we need a revolution in business, And he said, and it's happening. It's happening, at least it's starting. Franz Joseph Rademacher talked about some concrete practical things like the gradual shift in transparency of ownership of property and how changing attitudes towards that transparency can have a real practical impact on society and behavior. Corinne Lepage said we have the tools and we have the means. But at the same time, there was an underlying theme that kept resurfacing in one presentation after another, something I think we all can resonate with, and we know there's truth in it. There are major obstacles in the way that are preventing us from doing all that we know we can do, or think we can do, or have the capacity to do. Governance was mentioned as a critical obstacle, and we flagged it, but we really haven't talked much about the solution yet. The need for leadership, the money, the impact of doing the right thing, climate or environment that it might have on people, and society, and incomes, and living standards. The vested interests that are there in the society that will fight to hold on to the benefits, or even the question came up to preserve the inequality that they have. And another recurring theme, at least 3 or 4, maybe more speakers spoke to it, and we saw the scouts up here, which are a good representative of it, that the solution is not going to come solely or exclusively or maybe predominantly from government, that it really is going to require a grassroots effort of unprecedented magnitude at a global level. Well, when I try to put all of this together, I come up with a set of contradictions. Contradictory things. We've got an insoluble problem. We've got an urgency at the time. We've got tools, we've got means, we've got things that are being done, and we've got very, very serious obstacles that are resisting change. An Indian philosopher, Sri Aurobindo, once said that contradictions are complements. A Canadian mathematician, William Byard, who's written a very interesting book called Deep Thinking, says all creativity comes from confronting contradictions and being willing to hold those contradictions in our consciousness at the same time and look for ways, creative ways to reconcile them. And I think somehow, I don't know what the secret of the conference technology was, but I think this Green Cross has done a wonderful job in the mix of people and topics and in the contributions of speakers of presenting this as a real picture of opportunity and a real picture of crisis. And it is our task to help in ourselves and collectively to see how we reconcile these contradictions. And fortunately, we have one more day to do that. So much for an overview. I'd like to mention 3 or 4 points that I've been touched on, but I think in efforts at reconciliation need to be given very serious consideration. The first one has certainly been touched on, and that's money and financial markets, but I'd like to just make a slightly different point. A contentious point that money is not the obstacle to solving the problems. The world has about $225 trillion in financial assets, and when I say it's not the obstacle, I mean there's no shortage of money. Our problem is not, the problem is how that money is being utilized. Arguably, only about 20% of it now is really going into the real economy, into promoting human welfare, and a lot is having negative consequences. The rest is floating around. One of the fellows of the World Academy, Yehuda Kahan, he's an economist from Israel, who's been working in the insurance industry for many years. He's also a dynamic entrepreneur. He approached the world's largest insurance companies and pension funds about 8 years ago, 2006, as a preparation for Rio. And he said, look, if we don't address these environmental issues, who's going to lose the most? In terms of finance, it's going to be the pension funds and insurance companies who have about $70 trillion of financial assets. And the number one priority that they have to have is to preserve those funds for the future. And of course, if there is continuing increasing calamities and crises all over the world and increasing uncertainty, that's not an environment in which these long-term financial institutions can manage effectively their portfolios for the benefit of all the pensioners and insurees that own it. And so he said, we need arguably, about his figure was $4 trillion a year of investment in progressive efforts that will lead a transition to a new economy and a new society. You're reinvesting about $7 trillion a year. The bulk of those funds should come from you as the best sound, safe investment, not as a gift, not as aid, not as philanthropy, but as good business sense for the future. And he actually managed to get them to sign a convention in Rio, some of the largest companies committing to invest a few $1 trillion a year in this basis. Now, whether those investments are being made or not, the argument was compelling. They were convinced, and they gave them an award for presenting it. But I think it illustrates the point that it's not a lack of money that's holding us back from this transition. Second point I'd like to mention briefly is we've talked about employment, and for me, that's an absolutely critical issue. There's no solution to the future economy or future ecology that doesn't, first of all, ensure that people have a right livelihood. We cannot have a viable society, a stable society. We can't afford, we're going to have hundreds, now we're seeing a few million people coming from the Middle East. The migration patterns and everything will be just unimaginable if we don't address this point. I'm not going to go into it except to say, I believe there are solutions to that problem. Within the World Academy of Art and Science, we've been working on it for many years. And I'm just going to give one argument now. That we have a long list of unmet needs in the field of education and healthcare and in many other areas, social services and many other things. And we have a huge number of underemployed or unemployed human resources who could be utilized to meet those needs. So there's no inherent incapacity for us to raise living standards and improve well-being and welfare of people. We need a system that more effectively utilizes the resources that are there now in surplus to meet needs that are not being met. Whereas now, renewable scarce resources that are polluting the environment and taking away from the future and undermining human welfare, and we have incentivized programs to encourage that rather than encourage the shift to system that will really generate the incomes that people need as well as provide the services. Another issue that was mentioned was, which Alexander first flagged and a number of speakers did, I think Bill Ritter also, about that business has to play a critical role in this. And I agree with what he said. There is evidence. I'm a business consultant in my spare time, and there is evidence of a fundamental shift, not everywhere certainly, not with all companies certainly, but a significant, unprecedented shift in business to recognize that without taking responsibility for social consequences and impact on society and people, the future of business will not be very good. For most business will not be very good. Some of you may be familiar with the B Corp, or we call the for benefit corporations. 4 or 5 years, half of the states have passed new legislation authorizing, legalizing corporations to do things that do not maximize their profits and to protect them from shareholder suits, from shareholders who are say you're not doing everything you can to maximize profit. Corporations today have a legal right to pursue non-financial goals and objectives. And this is a movement that needs to increase. And then my final point, and then I want to open it for the discussion, is about governance, because it was a recurring theme. We had a webinar about 10 days ago about the Greek crisis, and the question just kept coming up. Why is it that we are fighting against an economic ideology that was proven ineffective and discarded 70, 80 years ago? Where did this resurgence of neoliberalism, uncontrolled, unregulated free markets come from? And why are we arguing again something we learned in the 1920s, we learned in the Great Depression that this formula doesn't work, and yet we're fighting it again as if it's a first time. And I think if you look back, there are many answers to it, and it has a history. But for me, the fundamental turning point was the end of the Cold War. Because with the end of the Cold War, two things happened. Many things happened, but two particularly. One was capitalism lost its complement. Capitalism lost anybody on the other side saying there's an alternative social model that should keep us reasonable and rational about the implications of our theory. Secondly, we had the opening up and globalization. And suddenly corporations could move into the global markets in an unprecedented way beyond the regulation of any nation states or governments. We have a Wild West, and therefore the issue of governance, there's no way I think we can tackle these issues without tackling the issue of global governance, which is a theme that was mentioned many times. At the same time, the issue of governance at the national level is a little different. And again, I think it was Bill Ritter, but there were others who also alluded to it. The fact of the matter is, what we call democracy, and I'm an American and I'm talking about my own country, but what we call democracy would be much more appropriately called plutocracy, because it's under the illusion that we are free and we are deciding things. It's really money that is deciding the policies that are met. And I don't think we're going to come to solutions without addressing these critical issues as part of an overall formula. So with that, I'd like to open it for questions, first to the panelists and then to the audience. Looking at the big picture, I'm trying to go beyond the wonderful practical suggestions, solutions, examples that have already been given. But just so we don't walk away from here or I don't walk away from here in exhilaration and wake up tomorrow morning and say, didn't we forget something? I'd just like to put the question on the table. What will it take? What do you think it will take to really make the magnitude of change and the magnitude in intensity and in scope and reach of change needed for us to move to a new model or a new paradigm? Among our panelists, would anybody like to? Roberto?
Well, I think that you can only really get true change if you get a change in the human condition. I think that we are not built, or we have not been built in the last 50 years or 100 years, thinking about future generations. We're going to have to really make that one of the principal tenets. So unless you improve the human quality, we're going to be always attacked by short-termism, crooked politicians, money speaks. We really have to change the human quality.
Anyone else have to?
Yeah, I mean, I would throw in leadership here. It's easy to underestimate the power of leadership. I mean, of course, a lot of this is structural, but some of it is intentional as well. Whether it be mayors or business leaders or politicians, they can and do make a difference. I mean, I come from a country where, you know, Politics is very Anglo-Saxon, similar to that in the US and in Australia and in Canada. Therefore, you'd expect the UK to be rather skeptical on climate change and pro-markets. It is pro-markets, but it had a leader who, for a while, before imploding over Iraq, was very, very popular, and he pushed the agenda on climate change. And so it became a very popular agenda. And you know, anyone who knows the UK knows it's a cynical bunch of very skeptical people who don't like politicians. But when they're shown strong leadership, you get results. And as a result, we've got the Climate Change Act. It was opposed by only 5 MPs, and you've got a rather strong legislative framework on climate change in a country which could have been very different. I mean, you saw the divergence between the UK experience under Blair and the American experience under Bush. I think the power of those two leaders at the time when they were popular and therefore given credence made a very big difference to the path that those economies showed.
Great. Anybody else? Yes, please.
So you're right, Gary. The question of addressing climate, environmental decline, diversity destruction cannot be left to charity. It has to be at the core of everything that we do. And for that to happen, the invisible hand of the market needs a helping hand from the regulators, and it needs some enforcement, it needs some standards. And the enforcement is absolutely critical, and the standards must be right, as we've seen with the diesel crisis recently. And is the diesel crisis only the tip of the iceberg? Is there more? Well, the regulators need to act, the politicians act, and for the politicians to act, well, we all have a role to play, and that's called democracy, that's called our responsibility for this. So we all have a responsibility to make things right.
Anybody out there like to try this question? What will it take to make this magnitude of change? Yes, please.
No, I had a general questions, mainly to Adam, to all of you really. Why does Green Course not include the livestock industry in these talks? The livestock industry creates nearly 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, methane gas, CO2, through raising livestock and growing food for livestock. 60% of forest clearing is for grazing and growing food for livestock. The forests are the lungs of the earth. But on all these conferences, COP 220 or whatever, nobody talks about this. It's the biggest factor of greenhouse gas emissions. And you don't talk about it. Please tell me why.
No, we have not excluded it. In fact, we'll be doing a number of events between now and the COP with Yann Arthus-Bertrand that will be focused exactly on that. So I invite you to stick with us for the next events that will be happening in Paris in the coming.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else on this first question? What will it take? Yes, please. Sorry, yes. Who are you pointing to?
The roof.
Okay, we'll go way back there. And then
Merci. J'ai en fait 2 questions. La première, quel regard portez-vous sur le rôle de la société civile et des partenariats publics-privés sur le développement durable de façon globale, au sens large du terme? Voilà ma première question. La deuxième question, comment peut-on allier le développement durable à la justice durable et à la paix durable surtout? Merci.
Bonjour. Depuis ce matin, on nous parle de kilowatts, on nous parle de gaz carbonique, on nous parle de température. Je n'ai entendu personne parler des ondes électromagnétiques qui perturbent tous les êtres vivants. Est-ce que vous avez déjà engendré une recherche sur ce plan ou est-ce que vous voulez avoir des informations? Ça fait 35 ans que je travaille sur ce sujet et j'ai derrière moi 47 publications scientifiques internationales que je tiens à votre disposition. J'attire votre attention sur le fait que Paris Match a publié un article de 3 pages dernièrement en disant que la nocivité des ondes aurait des conséquences pires que celles de l'amiante sur la vie des gens.
Thank you very much. Ernst, did you? Please.
Gary, I very much like your comment about the end of the Cold War and globalization, which in a sense is the same phenomenon. During the Cold War, it was necessary for the rich, for capital, for financial markets to respect democratic majorities, because democracy was the bulwark against communism. After that, had no need any longer. And this is, in a sense, what is called globalization. But bringing this back to the evident need for a better economic theory, I would like to refer to Adam Smith, for whom it was absolutely clear that the geographical reach of the markets, of the invisible hand, and the geographical reach of the law were identical. Globalization is a situation where markets are global and the law is national. Now you guess who is winning? The markets are winning over